All right, thank you for waiting, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with this morning's webinar on the Dataset Labeling Workbook. Thank you for attending. My name is Ann Schaefer. I will be running through today's training. If you have any questions about the Dataset Labeling Workbook, we'll be more than happy to take them. Please send those in to the chat or the questions area in the GoToWebinar. If your question is very specific, we will address it with you by email. We'll follow up after the webinar. And we'll try to follow up with every general question that we receive that's applicable to all during the webinar itself. Again, thank you for attending. So at this point, you can see my screen, I hope. If you can't, please let us know, again, either by the questions or by the chat dialogue. Let's take a moment to discuss what the Dataset Labeling Workbook is and essentially what it's going to allow you to do. The Excel Dataset Labeling Workbook is a separate file that, when used in conjunction, particularly with an Excel or CSV dataset, provides you with overall quicker analysis. You end up with better labeled tables and charts. Those lead in turn to clearer key insights, and of course those can then be shared online or offline with any of your clients. The Dataset Labeling Workbook definitely has its benefits, but sometimes you need a little bit of assistance in learning the details of how to work with it. So essentially, we are going to go ahead and take a look at that workbook and how it connects to Excel datasets in MarketSight. All right, so let's actually switch over to MarketSight at this moment. I currently have our 10.8 version of MarketSight up and running, and we are looking at an Excel-based dataset that I've uploaded to the application. This Excel dataset was text-based. That is, all of the variables that were in that dataset had text values in them. If I take a look at this dataset here in MarketSight, I can see that there are a number of interesting things that are going on. Let me go ahead and, in fact, show my variable values column so we can see even more. Taking a look at some of these individual variables, we can see that for the most part, MarketSight has uploaded those text-based variables, and it's already done something for us. It's essentially taken those variables and it's given them numeric values. For example, let's take a look at the age variable here. If I open up that dialog with a left click, I can see that each of my categories, and these were originally text in my dataset, have been assigned a numeric value code. MarketSight is performing this auto-coding for me automatically anytime I upload an Excel or CSV file. This is often great, and it often works perfectly well. There are some situations, however, in which you might wish to have finer control over the labeling scheme with your Excel dataset. For example, let's take a look further down here at this communique recommend variable. This was a rating scale variable. If I take a look at this, it was originally a 1 to 7 scale with a don't know value, or an NA. MarketSight has gone ahead and auto-coded this for me. It's numerically analyzed and given numeric values to each of my variable values. However, as you've probably noticed here, my values are now out of order as a result. In my rating scale, these numeric values have been assigned based on alphabetical order. As a result, we end up with definitely would not and definitely would together when they were definitely different in the original rating scale. In a situation such as this, a dataset labeling workbook will assist us in controlling this labeling and essentially allow us to make sure that our rating scale is in the order that we specify. A dataset labeling workbook is also useful in situations where a respondent may not have answered any particular value. So say, for example, no one answered definitely would not recommend. In that case, if a value has not been answered, MarketSight does not assume it exists. The Dataset Labeling Workbook, in contrast, will allow us to tell MarketSight that that value should exist regardless of whether someone has answered it or not. Further down in my dataset, I'll see another use of the Dataset Labeling Workbook. If I take a look at these particular variables right here, these three, these are examples of what tends to happen in an Excel file with a multiple response variable. Excel itself, as a file format, does not really have a means of defining a multiple response set. It has no way of sort of assembling the predecessor or original variable options together. So what you end up with in an Excel dataset is in fact separate variables for each of your yes/no options. This is all well and good, but of course you may wish to have those variables as they were originally shown in your dataset. In that case, you could of course create those variables in MarketSight, but you can actually use the Dataset Labeling Workbook now to create them at the time of upload. So there's definitely an additional function there that can be handy. Let's go ahead and take a look at another dataset in MarketSight here. I'm going to switch to a numeric dataset. So this is another example of a common Excel format. In a strictly numeric dataset that's either in Excel or in CSV, we'll get something like this when we upload it to MarketSight. You'll see that the variable code and the name are the same, and also that my values, although they exist, are not clearly labeled. And while certainly nothing is stopping me from opening each of these and creating labels by editing values, there's definitely a much more efficient means of doing that, and that is the Dataset Labeling Workbook. So in sum, if you have an Excel dataset that is text-based, there are advantages to the workbook. And if you have an Excel dataset that is numeric, there are also advantages to using the workbook. Let's now take a look at where we can find the workbook and what this workbook is and what it contains. In order to locate a copy of the workbook, the easiest location is to go to the home page of the MarketSight application. Here on the home page, I'll see that there is a Dataset Labeling Workbook link about halfway down the left-hand side. If I go ahead and open up this Dataset Labeling Workbook, that's going to give me a file that contains 3 worksheets. So give my Excel just one moment here. As I enable editing, you'll see that I have 3 worksheets here at the bottom. We have an instructions page, always good for a quick check if you need to know what to do. We have an examples page for, say, a visual look at what a Dataset Labeling Workbook will most likely appear like when you go ahead and fill it out. And then last but not least, we have a blank labels page. This is ultimately the page that we're going to take a very close look at. We're going to fill this particular sheet out. MarketSight is going to look at this particular page. So at the time of upload, you'll find that this is the one that MarketSight is looking for. MarketSight will disregard the instructions and the examples page. So those pages don't need to be deleted. They can be left as is. As long as your labels page is filled out and it matches your data set, we'll be good to go at the time of upload. So that's what's in the Dataset Labeling Workbook to start with. Those 3 worksheets, the instructions, the examples, and then that blank worksheet itself. I've gone ahead and I've previously filled out another workbook that I've color-coded a bit so that it might better explain or visualize for you the way it looks and how it connects with the underlying variables. I'm going to go ahead and open a couple of additional files here. So I'm opening my completed workbook with my color coding, and I'm also going to upload, or open rather, my numeric data set. I'm going to take this and I'm going to move this over to the side of the screen so that way I can view both of these at once and give you a better sense of how these variables connect. Now, there are different kinds of variables, of course, as you are well aware, and those can all be handled in the Dataset Labeling Workbook. For example, Respondent ID here, or RESP ID, typically shows up as a text-based variable, as it often contains a combination of letters and numbers. This is corresponding with my second row here in my Dataset Labeling Workbook. Note that as an open-ended variable, I do not have to specify a value code or a value name in this workbook. I do, however, need to put in the variable code. So this does need to match what I see at the top of my column here in cell A1. MarketSight will look at this code, It will find it in my data set, and it will give the variable a name of respondent ID so that when I look at this in the application, it's much more clear than, say, the little bit of code by itself. But again, no value code and value name are required for a text-based variable such as this one. You'll note that my date and my time variables here in row 3 and row 4 also are blank in the variable code and in the value name column. These correspond to the variables here in columns B and C. These are also, in a way, open-ended. In reality, they're really numeric variables that have no labels, so they're continuous. Because of that, because it would also be rather impossible for a human being to put in every single possible time, for example, no labeling is required for those values or the value names as well. So that is why you see these first 3 variables here, but no value codes and no value names for them. Taking a look a little further down here, we see my quarter variable. This is represented by rows 5 through 8 here. The quarter variable, of course, corresponds with a variable in my data set here in column D. Now, what's interesting in particular with this one is that it's a good example of converting my data to numeric. If you have a text-based data set, you're definitely going to want to take this step. So rather than, say, having Q1, Q2, and Q3 as values here in my quarter, I instead have individual numeric values 1 through 4. Those values are indicated here in my value code column, and I've then labeled those values with the value name seen here in column D. Converting a text-based data set to numeric is going to be essential if you want the Dataset Labeling Workbook to work properly. Otherwise, it may not work as anticipated. Other variables in my data set have also been converted to numeric. If I skip down a little bit here in my workbook, I'll see that row 19 through 26 here corresponds to that numeric rating scale that we were looking at earlier within MarketSight. Those correspond as well to this variable here in my data set in column G. So as you can see, I'm no longer using the text values in my actual data set. Those text values are in fact limited to my value name column here in my Dataset Labeling Workbook. Again, the idea is that MarketSight will look for this variable code. It will match it in the data set. Once it matches it in the data set, it'll say, look for the value. It finds a 5. It would then label that 5 with my probably would recommend value here. So in sum, definitely convert your text workbook to numeric in order to have the labeling workbook apply properly. Now there are, again, some additional examples of variable types if I scroll down a little further here. One that's particularly of interest would be the multiple response variable that we discussed earlier. If I look at the multiple response variable, that's actually been split up into several rows here in several different variables. Each of these, from row 36 down to about row 41 there, those are all representing those individual predecessors that I first saw in that Excel text-based data set. Those match with these variables here in my Excel data set. As I look at these, I can see that these are all yes-no questions, in which 0 represents the no, and 1 represents the yes. So again, I've taken the text out of my data set, converted it to numeric values, and I'm really supplying those no and those yes labels through the Dataset Labeling Workbook. Now that's happened for all 3 of those individual predecessor variables. However, if I take a look at the next variable that pertains to these guys here, the features MRV, I'll see that these rows do not directly correspond with the variable that's in my data set. The reason why is because this variable is one that I'm in fact using the workbook to create. If I expand my workbook here so that you can see more of it, this is actually one that my workbook is creating It's going to create a variable named features underscore MRV. It will have the label, what features do you have, MRV. It's going to be placed into a category called MRV so that I can find it easily. It will have question text, what features do you have in your plan? But most importantly, it's going to be looking for these particular variables, which I labeled here above. So it's going to be looking to include O1, O2, and O3. And of those variables, I've instructed it to count the value equal to 1. And again, if I take a look back at those original variables there, that 1 is equal to my yes. So in sum, these rows, although they do not correspond to an existing variable in my data set, will create a new variable based on these underlying original predecessor variables that will count 1 and therefore count my yeses. So definitely an interesting function there. Now we've looked at how this variable and the other variables in this particular workbook sort of split up, but let me mention a few additional fine details about the layout here with the Dataset Labeling Workbook before we fill out a few examples of our own. Taking a look at this workbook, as you can see, the most important columns most definitely are the variable code, the variable name, and then subsequently the value code and the value name. With any of these columns, we'll give you any hints by mousing over that column header. One thing I would point out is that we have some capabilities in this workbook that are definitely useful. For example, MarketSight, the Dataset Labeling Workbook, can now categorize variables. This is a feature that is relatively new to this workbook. Any variable that's in your data set that you choose to label using the workbook can be applied to a single category. That will then subsequently make it much easier to locate when I'm working on my data set for analysis. As you can see, all I need to do is really put in that variable code, label it if necessary, and then specify that category name. I can create categories as well, so these don't have to already exist in my data set. MarketSight will create the categories for me as long as I filled out something within this column. The next column that I do want to point out is the description and question text. This one is strictly voluntary. You don't have to do this one at all. That said, it can be useful if you're looking to pull the full question text into the description of your variable. As you may know, we often recommend having very short variable labels so that they're easy to see and read in crosstabs and charts. But sometimes you do occasionally want that full question text from the survey. In that case, this particular column here, description and question text, can be a great place to put that. The next column of interest will be the missing values column. This is another relatively recent capability of this workbook. Taking a look at this, let's say dissect demo 1 here and figure out what this particular missing value means. If I take a look, I've specified 8 here as a missing value. That corresponds with this 8 value here, which is actually my decline to answer value. So if there are values that you want to omit from your calculations, missing values are the way to do it. And to create a missing value, you simply specify, as you can see, a value. Missing values can also be ranges. So if I mouse over here, for example, you'll see that if you enter a range, you'll want to use a dash for that. So if I had more values, such as decline to answer, don't know, NA, other, values such as that, I could say 8-10, for example, and any value, 8, 9, and 10, will be counted as missing and therefore not taken into account for my calculations. If you find yourself having to set multiple missing values within your MarketSight data set, this is a great way to go. Now, last but not least, those 2 final columns here in this workbook, variables included in an MRV and values to count in MRV, are ultimately only really used when dealing with that new variable type that we showed here in rows 42 to 43. So those last 2 columns only need to be dealt with if you are choosing to make a multiple response variable using the Dataset Labeling Workbook. A couple of other fine details in terms of the Dataset Labeling Workbook that you'll want to be aware of. MarketSight is essentially, again, reading down and to the left. So you'll note that in the case of each of these variables, I have not repeated the variable code in subsequent cells, even though I may have multiple values for that variable. So MarketSight is taking a look, but it sees quarter. It'll read all of the values that it sees as part of quarter until it finds the next demo or code name, I should say. So again, you don't need to repeat the variable code in each row, and you don't need to repeat the variable name in each row. You can just specify that once for each variable. MarketSight again will associate all of the values until it sees the next code with that same variable. Another way to save time, again, is going to be essentially using the tools of the trade or the tricks of the trade in Excel itself. Let me go ahead and briefly close this workbook. We're going to take a look now back at our numeric data set and as well as our Dataset Labeling Workbook here. So I'll move that over so that we see the two of those at once. Now, when I mention the tools of the trade with Excel datasets, many of you are probably familiar with these Excel functions already. For example, the variable code, as we've mentioned, needs to be an exact match for the variable codes that I see here in the first row of my data set. Of course, if I choose to manually type these codes in, I leave myself open to typographical errors. Therefore, transpose is a wonderful function that you may wish to be aware of if you don't already know of it. In order to use transpose, you'll first want to make sure that you copy that particular row or those cells. I personally am a right clicker, so if I go over to my Dataset Labeling Workbook here and I right click on my cell here, I'll get my Paste Options dialog, and I'm looking for this one right here, Transpose. If I select Transpose, that's going to place all of those variable codes right in that column for me. So that's one way to get your variable codes quickly and accurately into your Dataset Labeling Workbook. Now, I personally will put in some space. If you forget to delete the space later, so let's say, for example, I insert a row so that I have a visual separator between the time variable and the quarter variable, it's okay if I leave that there. I don't have to remember to remove it, not a problem. Sometimes what can also be useful, especially if I know that I'm going to be working with variables that have lots of values, or at least far more than a single row, is you can select multiple rows at once, and then however many rows you select, that sounds a little weird, but it is true, however many rows you select, if you right-click and then choose to insert, the Excel file will actually insert that same number of blank rows. So in this case, if I have 12 rows selected, and I right-click on that row header there, and I choose to insert, I now have 12 blank rows that have been inserted in between my variables. Formatting doesn't matter either. So if at some point you decide that you need to, say, color code your dataset workbook in order to figure out which variable is which, such as I did in my example sheet, not a problem. MarketSight will disregard any formatting. So you can put in, colors, you can change the fonts. That's not taken into consideration. Whatever helps you fill out the workbook accurately, that's fine. In terms of other variable assistance tips in filling things out, one of my favorite things to do with Excel is autofill, if you're familiar with that. Now, with autofill, that's a function in Excel where you can either fill out a single data series in repetition, or you can fill out a pattern. So say, for example, if I put in the value codes 1 and 2 here, and I select both of them, you might see it's a little small, but there's a little itty-bitty sort of square down here in the lower right-hand corner. If I take and click and drag that square down, Excel will go ahead and will auto-fill in all of those numbers for me. This can be really handy if you don't want to accidentally miss something. Say, for example, you are putting in a list of the 50 states. Clearly, you don't want to accidentally skip a number. That'd be a little awkward. So autofill can definitely be a good way to quickly get in your value codes. Now, in the case of something like our rating scale variables, I'm going to go ahead actually and undo my change there. Let's see, Demo 01 I believe was one of those, but let's use this guy here, Recommend 01. Now I believe that was a 7-point scale, so I will go ahead and I will select at least 7 rows. I will then right-click to insert my rows, and I'm essentially ready to label this variable. Any name that I put in is fine, but again, shorter is probably better with those variable names. I can put in just a single number and still use autofill. In this case, since I've only got that single number, it's going to assume that I want that copied. But if you take a note, you'll see that this little box appears here for the autofill options. If I click on that, I will see an option to fill series, and that will get that same effect as earlier when I created 2 values and selected those. Now, with any sort of thing that I put in with the workbook, I do want to be aware, of course, that I can copy and paste. So if you have, say, multiple variables that use the same value scale, such as my Recommend 02 variable here, might as well just copy-paste the numbers and the names that you've entered and go from there. Those would probably be the most useful tips and tricks for quickly filling out a labeling workbook. The other major thing I would say is remember to save this file. Especially if you find yourself doing appends in the future, you'll want this file again. And of course, if you have this file filled out, well, you don't have to do it a second time. If you make changes to an appended file, say for example you're adding a variable, it's of course much easier to add a single variable to a workbook than it is to add all of the variables all over again. So definitely remember to save this file and don't get rid of it if you're going to be doing any sort of appending or tracking studies. All right, so that said, let's discuss how we actually apply this workbook and how we use it with the data sets themselves. For that purpose, I'm going to be switching back to my home page here in MarketSight, and I'm going to go to the Datasets page. Now, I have 2 options here with the Dataset Labeling Workbook and how to apply it. I can go ahead and I can apply it to an already uploaded dataset, and I can apply it with a dataset that I'm uploading at that moment in time. So, for example, we had our original numeric dataset here that had no workbook. If I take a quick look at the variables page, just as a quick refresher, we can see that those variables have no labeling. As a result, I have things like this, 7 values between 1 and 7. Great. I can use the Dataset Labeling Workbook on this already uploaded dataset. To do that, I'm going to want to right-click on this file. So back in my Datasets screen, once I've right-clicked, if I look down a little ways in that menu, I'll see a Properties option. Here in the Properties, I'll see that I have my source, which is a file. It's going to list my dataset file there. And then I'll see a box here, Replace the Dataset Labels File. And we note that it is recommended for Excel datasets. At this point, I'm going to select and I'm going to browse for that file that I filled out earlier. So I'm going to browse for my completed workbook. Once I've selected that, all I need to do is click OK. Now I am going to change my name here just so I know that it has a workbook now, and I'll click OK for that. But I do have one already uploaded, so we'll say 2. That fixes that. MarketSight is going to check for any updates. This is going to happen especially if you have variables in use, but usually there is no problem. You'll see it go to 100% very quickly, and you'll be able to click Done. Once you've done that, you'll note here that my variables seem to have already changed. And if I go back to my variables page and I refresh this page, I'll note that now my values are labeled. The categories that I mentioned have been created, and the variables that I specified for those categories have been placed into them. So I've been very, very effective by using that Dataset Labeling Workbook. I've accomplished many things at once. So that's one way to apply a filled out Dataset Labeling Workbook, is to add it to a dataset that's already in MarketSight. The second way to apply a Dataset Labeling Workbook is, of course, to upload it with the dataset itself. We would definitely recommend this approach if at all possible. So it's usually preferable to create the workbook and upload it with a new file rather than try to do it after the fact. So in order to upload a new dataset, if I right-click on my folder and choose New Dataset, I'll see a very similar screen. I'll see my source, which is a file. I'll be able to browse for my data file. In this case, I'm going to select my numeric dataset. And then I'll see again that box for my dataset labels or metadata file, and that's where I'm going to choose my completed workbook. Once I have those, I can name this however I would like. In this case, I'll put in today's date just to make sure that it is unique. And then I simply click OK. Once MarketSight uploads that dataset, my labels will automatically be applied, and I will be ready to go from the beginning. So now that that dataset's uploaded, MarketSight has selected it, and as you can see, my datasets are labeled. And if I head to that variables page there, as before, I'll see that everything has been labeled, my categories have been created, and any missing values that I specified have been added. All right, that is basically the main content of our Dataset Labeling Workbook training. So I do want to bring up my sort of little best practices slide here for you. Again, remember that we are looking primarily for clean data when we begin, primarily numeric data if at all possible. Ideally, brief variable names are what you want to aim for in the variable names columns. And of course, in order to make this process as easy as possible, remember the Excel tools of the trade. So transposing, auto-filling, copy-pasting, simple things really, but often overlooked in times of duress or deadlines. Now at this point, let's take a moment to cover some of the questions that might have come through and see if there are any interesting ones that may be relevant to everyone. As we mentioned before, if you did have a very specific question about your data set, that's not a problem. Customer service will be following up with you by email after the webinar today. So we do thank you for any questions, and please do send us those questions. All right, so I do see a couple of questions here that are definitely relevant. Can I leave blank rows in my workbook? The answer for that is yes. So if you do have any sort of blank rows left in the workbook, that's fine. Again, MarketSight is going to disregard that. It's simply going to look for that next variable code in the workbook. Therefore, by that logic, any sort of formatting that you also add, that's fine as well. So if you use colors, if you use highlighting, that will work just fine. There's no need to really worry about that at all. All right, looking at our questions here. Do you need to convert your data to use the workbook? The answer to that is yes, you really should. Technically, you can certainly apply the workbook to a text-based data set. However, we can't guarantee that the results will be exactly what you expect. Because if you think about it, if a text-based data set is uploaded, it's going to have to be automatically coded before the workbook can be applied because MarketSight is looking for those numbers in the workbook. As a result, we would definitely recommend that you use a numeric data set. So I would definitely convert your data first. If you've made a mistake in your file, that's also one where you can just re-upload a new labeling file. So I would go to the properties of your data set. And in the properties of your data set, remember that you can select that new file, and that will overwrite the original. All right, looking at our questions. If you forget to label a variable code, that sort of depends. Sometimes the Dataset Labeling Workbook, depending on where that error is, will fail, so it won't be applied as expected. And in other cases, it will go through, but you will still not have a label. So you may end up with, say, a code where it's just the code for both the variable code and the name, but in other cases, it might not be applied. If that's the case, if you notice something like that, as before, we just mentioned that previous question, you can always apply another Dataset Labeling Workbook. So you can fix that error and then just apply it once again. All right, looking through our questions again. All right, open-ended responses. Any open-ended response, you will need the variable code. So that's that first column. You will need the variable name. That's the second column. but you do not need to put in values. So because you do not need to put in values, you can just leave the value number and the value name columns blank. You don't need to specify those, just the variable code and the variable name for any open-ended or strictly numeric questions. So things like age, for example, if you want somebody to type in their age, that's another example of a variable where you can put in the code and the name, but leave the values blank. All right. Let's see, it looks like most of the rest of the questions are fairly dataset specific or specific to projects. So for those, we'll go ahead and we'll follow up with you after today's training session here. We do thank you for attending our training session. We appreciate your time and energy today. And again, if you do have any questions later on, please feel free to follow up with us at customer service, and we'll be happy to help. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.